Okay, guys, welcome back to Rotten Reviews. On this episode, I'm going to take a look at the 1992 movie Universal Soldier. It has a tomato meter rating of 24% rotten and an audience score of 46%, again, rotten. Now, unlike my previous review of Nicolas Cage's movie Next, in which I wanted to take a look at why the movie wasn't actually ranked worse than it was on Rotten Tomatoes. I'm going to take the opposite tack here, and I'm going to just suggest, that this movie does not deserve to be rotten. And of course, Rotten Tomatoes argues that not only is this original Universal Soldier movie rotten, but also the others in the series. For example, Universal Soldier: The Return, 1999, again with Claude John Van Damme. This is considered even more rotten by both critics and the audience. And the other highlight with Van Damme in the series is Universal Soldier: Day of Reckoning from 2012. This is actually rated a little better with the critics at 56% rotten, but a little worse with the audience at 34% rotten. Again, there are at least 7 films in this so-called franchise, Universal Soldier. All of them are considered rotten. I've just shown you the highlights: the 2012, 1999, and the original. I'm not going to go into the sequels. I would agree mostly they're all rotten. I just want to take a look at the original movie by Roland Emmerich, and it stars Van Damme and at the time, a much bigger star, Dolph Lundgren. Both of them are together. They have good chemistry. They both have other action movies that are very enjoyable. I just kind of wonder, does this deserve to be rotten? My thought is no, because at the time I enjoyed this movie when it first came out. I didn't see it in theaters. I saw it when it came out on home video release. I found it perfectly entertaining. Everybody I knew found it entertaining. And the thought out there now that this was some kind of ploy by Roland Emmerich to copy the Terminator franchise because T2, a year before was a big hit. That wasn't a thing at the time, and nobody I know that enjoyed this movie made the comparison at all. So I don't think that's the case. I think that's looking back at hindsight and trying to read into it. So let's get into actual rotten reviews and find out why people have come to consider this completely rotten. We'll start off with 5 stars. Classic and awesome movie. I wouldn't give this 5 stars. I would say this is 2.5, maybe could peak at 3 stars depending. But I would say it's solid 2.5 stars. Certainly not rotten. If I had to give it an actual guess on where I thought the audience review percentage should stand, I would say 60%, 62, 63% not rotten. But let's see what we find. 3 stars. Well made, but silly action vehicle for its 2 muscle men. Would like to be as good as the Terminator, but isn't by a far cry. See, again, people comparing it to the Terminator. I don't get the comparison. Yes, they are cybernetically enhanced soldiers. But again, aside from using technology, I don't see the comparison with the Terminator at all. 3.5 stars. Excellent film. Has great action and great characters. Villain was cool. I would agree that, when this movie starts, because I queued it up again just recently for this review, to make sure I wasn't totally off on the way I felt about it. The opening sequences of this movie showing the 2 characters back in 1969 Vietnam, it still works. You can tell it's Roland Emmerich. You can tell from the credits. You can tell from the use of the soundtrack. You can tell by the atmosphere in the Vietnam scenes. This is Roland Emmerich. You can particularly tell when it opens into the Hoover Dam sequence because it gives me the feeling of an Independence Day type of atmosphere. So it felt very familiar to me, and that opening scene in Vietnam came across completely fine to me today. It seemed a little closed in, like it felt more like it was on a soundstage than it did to me back in the day. But, that's with more than 20 years of films under my belt to be critical about. But no, it still felt fine. So we have another one here, 2.5 stars. It's all nonsense, but there's gore and plenty of action. A typical 90s action movie, great fun. Yeah, I'll agree with that. I don't think the gore was that over the top. I mean, yeah, you had Dolph Lundgren's character collecting ears. That's kind of a stereotypical, almost a movie cliche now from Vietnam. Full Metal Jacket comes to mind. But it didn't come across to me as gory. It came across to me as gore from a 90s action movie, like Independence Day. 3 stars. Yes, the plot is derivative, but it's unique in its own way, and the actors are good. Yeah, the plot might be derivative, but again, I don't consider that like something to drive the stake through the heart. I don't think that this is a rotten movie just because the plot was derivative. 4-star movies out there are completely derivative, so I don't count that as valid. 5 stars, iconic Van Damme and Dolph Lundgren, both in their physical prime, with a healthy serving of bare-ass Van Damme. I would largely agree with that, except for the 5 stars. 3 stars, Universal Soldier is a movie that has a silly premise about reincarnating soldiers and turning them into cyborg slaves. Of course, just like with any movie of this type, there is a remnant of the human in the reanimated brain that takes control. The science of the movie is beyond ridiculous, but I can take an off-the-wall concept if they don't try explaining it and just let you fill in the logic gaps yourself. Universal Soldier made the mistake of trying to justify the science. Well, I don't think they did make that mistake. I would agree that they did let you fill in enough on the science. I mean, they did kind of include some plot device mechanics, some limitations on the soldiers. For example, their body temperature is high and they can't stay hot. They have to be cooled down, like their bodies have to go into a freezer, a cryogenic chamber to stay cool, to regenerate. I kind of liked that. It was a nice plot device limitation on them being just total, Terminators, for example. I thought it worked well. This didn't come across to me as too cheesy because they weren't using a lot of CGI. If they did use CGI, I didn't see it. I saw all practical effects, makeup effects. It was 90s type stuff, so it didn't rub me the wrong way like that. It has slightly a comic book feel to it, like it could have been taken from a comic book, a dark comic book, but I don't think it was, and this predates comic book movies that we have now. But I found it completely acceptable. We have very popular comic book movies now that are plot-wise and, plot device-wise much worse than this movie. 2.5 stars. The film was Roland Emmerich's entry into Hollywood, and I can see why. Do you know that synonymous if you only know a movie title because you know exactly that has 10,000 copies in the DVD store with 50 direct-to-video sequels or prequels? That's just the case with Universal Soldier. I just wanted to know how and where it all started. I also like to see martial artists trying on more serious film projects. But then I remembered Roland Emmerich and I knew what I had to get involved again. Okay, so he's saying he went to the video store or maybe Walmart and he can see like all these different Universal Soldier B movies like piling up in the bargain bin. And so he just wanted to watch the first one to find out what started it all. Well, the first one's the best one. And 2.5 stars, I'll agree with that. I respect this review. 3 stars. Cashing in on the success of T2 came this shallow actioner that, in the most part, is hilariously bad. Again, I disagree it was cashing in on T2. This was probably well into production before T2 hit the scene. In large part due to Dolph's over-the-top villain, who is unintentionally funny. The story of the film is pretty simple, but pretty effective for a sci-fi action film, and it delivers in the action department. The action is non-stop and keeps it entertaining enough to get through. Basically, if you want to turn your brain off and laugh at a cheesy action movie, look no further. I don't think it's that cheesy, actually. It doesn't strike me like that, but I can accept that somebody found 3 stars in it. I say maybe 2.5, but okay. 3 stars. Not one of Van Damme's best films, but worth a watch if you haven't seen some good action in it. I think in this one, Van Damme isn't really showing off his martial arts that much. Yes, he's a trained soldier, but he doesn't come across as, taken out of Bloodsport or anything like that. It's kind of played down a little. Yeah, he's a super soldier, but this isn't a martial arts movie. And, at the time, Van Damme was known for, heavy on the martial arts stunts, even though a lot of it is, camera work to make him look cool. Um, but this movie doesn't strike me like that. It's more like a more subdued super soldier, Jean-Claude Van Damme. And in fact, even him being a super soldier, it comes off his fighting to be a little more realistic than stuff like, Bloodsport, for example. Um, Let's see, 3 stars. I'm really surprised how low the ratings are on this movie. Okay, it's not a masterpiece by any stretch. As far as silly action movies go, though, it's pretty good. The storyline is good, even though it's not necessarily believable. Dolph Lundgren is brilliant as Sergeant Scott, and it's got some great fight scenes. I feel this movie could benefit from a remake, reboot, if it was done right, that is. Well, it's been remade, rebooted, and continued several times. There are at least 7 movies out there. Three guaranteed, possibly 4 have some role in it with actually Van Damme himself. So they tried. It's not like nobody tried, but nobody could, make something better than the first one. 3 stars. Dolph Lundgren's performance is a gem of this movie. 5 stars. A highly underrated movie. This movie is highly enjoyable. Dolph Lundgren and Jean-Claude Van Damme did a great job. 5 stars. I think they did good jobs for what kind of movie it was, but I wouldn't give the movie 5 stars. Come on now. 2.5 stars. Military exercises for the pre-adolescent. Maybe, but if you look at modern comic book movies, then they must be made for 4-year-olds because they violate a whole lot more real-world logic than this movie does. 2 stars. Rival soldiers turned cyborgs fight for power in this silly, predictable paint-by-numbers action pick. Yeah, it's silly and predictable, but again, it's no more silly and predictable than our comic book movies today, not by a long shot. 5 stars. I just want to thank everyone who made this movie. It was an Oscar winner to me. Okay, but, Oscar winner, no. 4 stars, Spanish. 3 stars. When he was truly A-list, a solid 90s sci-fi flick, great action, and Lundgren is a nasty cunt as the baddie. Twitch off Walker. Yeah, in the 90s, these guys were the kings of action movies. They delivered what people wanted, and I think they did in this film. That's why I don't understand why it's got such a bad audience rating. 1 star. Really only 2 movies worth seeing in JVCD, and this ain't one of them. Okay. 2 stars. A mindless subpar sci-fi action film brought to you by the same man behind other garbage fests such as Independence Day, 10,000 BC, and the 1998 remake of Godzilla. Well, I agree that Roland Emmerich has had some bad, expensive bad movies put out there. I wouldn't consider this one to be expensive or bad. 10,000 BC is like really ridiculous and really expensive and really crammed full of CGI. It's 100% Roland Emmerich in every way, and it's a complete bomb, and it's completely nonsensical in every way. Independence Day at the time was a huge hit. Everybody I know loved it. I could do a rotten review, but only to see how, if it's aged badly. I don't think it really has. Our tastes have just changed. In its day, 1997, Independence Day was the bomb. I mean, it was awesome. The 1998 remake of Godzilla, nobody I knew liked it. I forgot that Roland Emmerich was part of it. It doesn't come across like his other movies. It has a different flavor. I agree it's bad. Don't compare this movie to those. This movie had a much lower budget, but yet it was better than those. Jean-Claude Van Damme sort of underacts and is very quiet throughout the film. Well, yeah, he's like a super soldier. He's not supposed to have a lot of words. Most of the film, he's unemotional, and he does play down the martial arts aspects a lot more than his previous films. Dolph Lundgren tries to overact, but somehow still feels restrained. Ali Walker does her best Jamie Lee Curtis impression throughout the film. Yeah, her performance does bother me. I don't know if it's because I've seen the same thing done so many times, but she comes across right away as the kind of half-assed serious news reporter that's, going against what the boss wants, and she's got a cigarette hanging out the side of her mouth at all times. Um, it works in this film, but again, it's cliched. It's cliched. It was cliched at the time, right from the beginning, but it wasn't enough to be off-putting. It's just nothing new there. 4 stars. Superb and has aged very well. It has aged very well. Superb, I don't know about that, but I was surprised queuing it up, a few hours ago. It hasn't aged badly. 5 stars, great film, watched last night. This is from 2014. 4 stars. I've watched this movie more times than is good for me. Well, obviously you like it then. Half a star. Why do I even bother? Full review soon. Well, okay, don't bother. 3.5 stars. Good 90s sci-fi movie. Yeah, 3.5 too high. It was certainly a lot better than other 90s sci-fi movies. It's not Roland Emmerich's worst by a long shot. It's worth watching once. 3 stars. The action on screen between Dolph Lundgren and Jean-Claude Van Damme is fun, even though it is sporadic. The story elements are interesting, considering it also makes the plot drag. Look for nothing too deep here. Well, there is a part of the movie where John Claude Van Damme's character, his name is Luke, because he's got to be French, right? I mean, you can't ignore the accent. He's from Louisiana. He goes back home after, decades have passed by. He's still young to visit his mom. That was a pretty cool concept. It didn't quite have the emotional impact I think the director was looking for, but it was pretty cool. It was a pretty cool direction to take the ending of the movie in. 4 stars. The first one is usually the best one, and this is it. I'll agree, but not the 4 stars. 4 stars. The first one is usually, yes. 5 stars. Love this movie. Universal Soldier. Van Damme goes head to head. Dolph Lundgren as Cyborg Warriors. Yeah, it's fun 90s action. Not 5 stars though. 3 stars, serviceable actioner, but I have seen better films from Lundgren and Van Damme. Yeah, we have. We've seen them in better films separately. And you know what's funny? Like, if you want to bring up Dolph Lundgren, some of the movies, not because of him, but that he's in, that are considered better right away, like, for example, The Expendables, Van Damme's in that too. Those movies have such high ratings. They're only trying to be crazy, fun action movies. But again, to me, they're not much better than this. In fact, in a lot of ways, they're worse. They have high value. They have high production value, big stars attached, all like playing up their roles as action stars. But they're no better than this, really. Although I know for a fact, without looking, their critic and their audience ratings are much higher than this movie. 2.5 stars. Highly flawed, though it entertains. Just the script and the acting let the film down. No, I wouldn't say so. There's no letdown there, and I agree with the 2.5 stars. 3 stars. Rather grumpy soldiers seem to enjoy using their weapons to cause mayhem and destruction. In this simple story, the actors have a blast at playing in the parts that are more often than not naked. The tractor trailer adds a great set piece to the action, providing some well-timed fun. Yeah, I'll agree with that. The tractor trailer, the cool trailer with the pods or the chambers where they go into like cryogenics, I thought that's pretty cool. That was like a major set piece that was hauled out at the beginning of the movie. It was considered cool at the time. It was cool. It is a cool concept, and right off the bat, also you can tell it's a Roland Emmerich theme. Right away I saw that along with the credit style, and I'm like, yeah, it's Roland Emmerich. But it was cool. 1 star. Typical lunk-headed Roland Emmerich, Dean Devlin stupidity. Okay, well, if you don't like Emmerich, then yeah. 2 stars. Wow, such suck. Much rip-off. Jean-Claude Van Arnold, very explosions, blah, blah, blah. So somebody, again, for the umpteenth time is comparing this to the Terminator franchise. I don't get why. Didn't come across to me at the time like that. I don't see why that's the thing now. 3.5 stars. A consistently entertaining science fiction action caper in which stars, okay, it's a summary, but they're giving it 3.5. I think that's too high. 4 stars. Now, one of my favorite action movies, doing what it sets out to do with gusto. Universal Soldier sets both Van Damme and Lundgren up as iconic figures they are today. Yeah, they're saying that this was, on the path to them becoming iconic action stars. It was. They had several after this. This isn't their highlight, but this is like they're on the road to becoming, their characters in Expendables, for example. This made them relevant today. 1.5 stars. Yes, it's a Terminator ripoff, but it's fun. No, it's not a Terminator ripoff. 1.5 stars. I remember this to be cooler when I was younger, not that campy, and they laugh. Yeah, well, everything ages poorly eventually. It's worse for some people than others. To me, I went back on this with an open mind. I'm probably, I am more than 20 years older than when this movie came out. It seemed fine to me. 3.5 stars. One of my favorite movies as a teen. Hard not to like it now. 3 stars. Flawed, but Emmerich manages to make it entertaining enough. Van Damme is nice, not much to say. Interesting concept. Nice little social commentary about the delusions of the American soldiers who went to war with Vietnam and came out alive. Yeah, there is a lot of that here. If you look beyond just looking at it as an action movie from the 90s, especially the first scene in Vietnam, how it compares to the ending, yeah, there is a message here, but it's not so heavy. It's not like a modern movie where they're trying to put this message ahead of everything else. That would be a big fail, right? Back in the 90s, people wanted to put messages in movies, and they did so while being subtle enough not to like overpower everything else. So I agree, there is a definite deliberate message here. 5 stars. Before he scored big with the sci-fi disaster hit Stargate, Independence Day, The Day After Tomorrow, and 2012, German director Roland Emmerich replaced The Fugitive to helm, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it's a summary listing off Emmerich's other stuff, but he gives it 5 stars. I'd say no, come on. Even as an Emmerich film, this is down there. 2.5 stars, 2.5 stars. 5 stars, okay, Spanish. 3 stars, a wild and electrifying robot war. Again, they're not robots, they're not Terminators. No, they're just people that have been enhanced and they've been altered. 3 stars, sort of a pale imitation of elements from the Terminator, but it's the clash between Van Damme and Dolph Lundgren that makes this film. The fight scene at the end is awesome, and the locations such as Hoover Dam and the Grand Canyon are interesting to say the least. Again, the T2 comparison. 4 stars, I love this movie, don't ask me why. 2 stars, not English. So I'm going to pretty much wrap this up. I think I've actually answered my question on this. Why does it have such a low audience score? I think that is because it is being compared to the Terminator franchise. For whatever reason, that's the way it strikes people now. It has for several years because I went back to 2013 reviews. This is not how it struck people back in 92. I was there. I was a fan of Terminator. I know it didn't strike us that way. So this is a case of audience score being dragged down by comparisons to other works. It's kind of, I guess, over the years melted together and given people the feeling, the Terminator feeling. That's what I'm thinking. So that answers my own question. Again, I don't think it deserves 46%. I think on its own, forget the sequels, forget the Terminator. Just put this up there as a 62 to 65%, not rotten, and you'll enjoy it. And I'm going to leave it here on this episode of Rotten Reviews.